be a voice, a vote, a community, a contributor to American society. To argue for the separation of church and state is not to argue for the separation of the church from the wider civil society. Essentially, the First Amendment says that the coercive power of the state shall not be placed in the service of any single religious group or behind religion versus irreligion. But that careful separation of the institution of religion from the institution of the state should never be read to say that the church ought not to be a voice, a participant, an active engagement in the civil society, the fabric of society that makes up our country. And so we should speak to the issues, debate the issues, talk to our own communities, talk beyond those communities. We should create institutions that feed the hungry, clothe the naked, that stand for the life of human beings from conception through natural death. We should do those things because the secular state does not say that is something we should not do. It will not help us. It may not listen to us. We may or may not be successful, but we clearly need to be part of the arena. Secondly, we live in a pluralistic society. By pluralism here, I don't mean necessarily ethnic pluralism, or I mean religious and moral pluralism, because that holds a special challenge. What does a pluralistic society mean? It means that within one civil society, you have groups that differ on the deepest questions in life. That's what religious pluralism means. That in one single society, you have people who disagree on the ultimate questions in life. Where we've come from, where we're going, and how we should live along the way. Now, there's a double challenge to a pluralistic society. On the one hand, the state and the law should protect the religious freedom of every individual and all its groups. Freedom to function is the first thing we seek. Secondly, however, the real challenge is when people disagree on the ultimate questions in life, are we able to find proximate agreement, limited agreement, to guide our law and policy? That is the real challenge of a pluralistic society. Because there are some things that are so important to the welfare of society that we can't simply leave it up to everyone goes their own way. This, of course, was the great struggle that eventually surfaced in the Civil War. There was a truth, and people had radically different conceptions of what the truth was, about who is human and who should be treated equally. And finally, Lincoln said, "A house divided cannot stand. We need a single vision." So, the constant challenge of a morally pluralistic society is how we fashion a common moral vision on a limited number of questions, to be sure. You don't try and get everybody to agree on everything. On a limited number of questions that will undergird our law and policy. Why is that important? Because law touches everyone. And therefore, since we all are going to be touched by law and policy, if we cannot find common moral vision to sustain law and policy, it fractures the fabric of society. We can live with it, but we don't live well with it. Now, if you take those first two things, a secular state, no special treatment, and a pluralistic society, we disagree on ultimate questions, you see the challenge for the social vision. We may hold certain truths deeply. The question is, can we convince the society of what we hold? Can we find a way to speak our deepest religious truth in non-religious language? so that others who do not share our faith might share moral wisdom with us. The third characteristic of the society is the capitalist economy, which has been part of this society from its inception. We live in the most complex, dynamic economy in the world. The consequences of how our economy does, or doesn't, if you will, are evident over the past year. If it goes wrong here, at least in this setting of the world as we know it, it spreads like a virus around the world. Catholic teaching has, over the last century, been in constant dialogue with the two major social systems that dominated most of the 20th century: liberal capitalism in the West and Marxist socialism in the East. Basically, the social teaching had differences with both systems, both in their premises and in their practical conclusions. But clearly, with the collapse of the Cold War and the collapse of Marxism, John Paul II was nicely positioned to, in a sense, bring the social vision about economy, the moral vision about economy, to a new stage of clarity. He argued that the market economy ought to be looked at in two steps. First, he stressed its assets. He said the market economy gives a certain rational allocation of goods in society. Secondly, it fosters ingenuity and freedom among people. And thirdly, it serves to protect the individual from an all-powerful state. Having cited the assets of a market economy, he then said there are also limitations. The first limitation is that in a market economy, some people have very little to enter the market with. So even if the market's working perfectly, if you don't have any money, it is fairly irrelevant to you. Secondly, more complicatedly, he said the market does not know how to value different goods. You can draw a supply and demand chart for the selling of automobiles. You can also draw a supply and demand chart for health care. But those are two different things. Someone might survive reasonably well without a car. They will not survive reasonably well if there's no health care. So his point was you had to invest certain goods with moral weight and say they are not to be simply subject to a supply and demand chart. Or to put it more generally, he argued what you ought to do is to surround the market with a framework of policy that makes up for what the market leaves untended. Those who aren't in it, or those goods that are essential for all. Finally, we are a global power. It is too evident to have to require much explanation. But what it means is that we never simply have domestic debates in this country. We always have debates about where we are internally and where we stand in the world. And the very scope of American power constantly poses questions, both of restraint and imperatives for action. And that is part of what Aquinas' vision was about. The three communities we belong to by nature: the family, civil community, and the human community. We obviously have different responsibilities to different people. One kind of responsibility to our children, one kind of responsibility to our country, and another kind of responsibility to the world. The real point is we don't have the same responsibilities to everyone, but we have some responsibility for everyone. Because everyone is the image of God, and we are linked to them. Flesh of our flesh, blood of our blood, Jesus of Nazareth. We who share human nature don't get to choose who we're related to. Jesus did that already. So then, how do you take a social vision and delve into cases